Hello everyone and welcome to our presentation on measuring student preference of closed captioning styles in language education. My name is Dr. Marco Shappeck.
And my name is Dr. Shelby Miller. Thank you for joining us today.
Here is a brief overview of our presentation today. In part 1, we will describe the problem in detail. Part 2 is really dedicated to explaining the research project that we are proposing and why we are embarking on it. In part 1, I will distinguish between closed captions, automated closed captions, and subtitles. Our talk and research proposal focuses on automated closed captioning for coursework in linguistics. We will view a few examples of how inaccurate closed captions may affect comprehension for the students. During our review of the published research on the topic, we highlight the benefits for students when closed captions are accurate and neatly organized. Finally, we propose a style guide that we are adapting for the captioning in our online materials for linguistics. This style guide is the main topic for part 2 of our presentation today, since we plan to test it out with both hearing and hearing impaired students. While we know that some form of punctuation and nonverbal markings help viewers understand the online lectures, we would like to investigate which features are best for our student body. We discussed the main objectives of our study and how we went about designing it. Captions are intended for viewers who cannot hear the audio. They are used to aid the hard of hearing by communicating audio sounds, including sound effects, speaker identification, and other non-speech elements. Subtitles are intended for viewers who can hear audio but cannot understand the language. Communicating dialogue, they are time synchronized with the speaker's turn taking. Subtitles do not transcribe non-speech elements like sound effects in an audio track. It's common knowledge that automated closed captioning struggles in the simplest of situations, where there is no background noise, no overspeaking, and only a few simple words need to be recognized. Expecting software to be able to understand and differentiate between accents, identify speakers, and know which background noises to exclude is highly unrealistic. Currently, only humans can write high-quality subtitles in closed captions, preferably transcribers with subject knowledge, a good ear, and a strong handle on punctuation and grammar. Perhaps this doesn't need to be mentioned, but automated closed captions are extremely fast and convenient for the presenter, while trained transcribers are painstakingly slow and need to be paid. Here we have automated captions from a lecture I recorded on Panopto, a platform that has been implemented at my university. Apart from the strange comma before it's, I'd like you to focus on the last 3 words, international ethnic alphabet. When the automated closed caption reader does not identify a word or string of words, it selects a possible word to replace it. Here we see an example of this with ethnic substituted for phonetic. The Panopto software could have been programmed to transcribe nonce words or exactly what was heard, such as phonetic or phonetic spelled phonetically. While it may seem like a good strategy to select an existing word in English that could possibly work out as the correct spoken word, this design feature actually causes other problems when we teach linguistics, since we do present and talk about nonce words or made-up words quite frequently, not to mention ungrammatical forms of a sentence or verbs to show how language learners progress through different stages of acquisition. On this particular slide, the full sentence was cut into different captions on different frames, so there is more to the text before, quote, therapies and other sounds. Arbitrarily cutting sentences or chunks of speech is commonplace with automated closed captioning systems, so that doesn't worry me. It's not the real focus of the presentation, and in all honesty, it usually doesn't cause issues in comprehension. However, in this particular case, the automated captions are quite different than what was spoken. I had said, sometimes they represent certain sounds and other times they represent other sounds. And Panopto came up with, sometimes they represent certain sound in the times, therapies, and other sounds. When we break down the sound segments by syllables between what was spoken and what was automatically transcribed, the computer program doesn't seem all that crazy. In and, highlighted in yellow, sound similar enough. The D from and seems to have been moved to become the onset of the first vowel of other, and other, which could sound like a casual spoken da. Finally, the they repres highlighted in green may in a certain cadence appear similar to therapies. They repres therapies. The problem with these voice recognition software programs is their attempt to search for existing words, and they do it pretty well when we look at syntax. In the times is a perfectly constructed prepositional phrase, yet the software struggles with semantics and sentence level meaning. Here in error example number 3, we have the mistranscribed 22 contained sounds. So while the word consonant is part of the average American English speaker's lexicon, that is, it's talked about in the educational setting extensively, it would appear that many words specific to academic disciplines are not the first guesses for these computer programs when they are unsure of what was spoken. If this happened to the word 22 consonant sounds, transcribed as 22 contained sounds, you can imagine words like phoneme, or suffix, or the be verb, or morpheme, or syntactic, or shibboleth. All of these linguistic words would not be transcribed accurately. In most cases, they do not select the correct word or spelling. This same argument can also be made in other fields of study, such as biology and chemistry, which have a relatively high amount of multisyllabic terms that are derived from ancient Greek or Latin. In short, these software programs make a mess out of the content. It is federal law to make educational content accessible to all students. The Americans with Disabilities Act is a civil rights law that prohibits discrimination against individuals with under the ADA and Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. Universities are required to provide reasonable accommodations to students. In higher education, all electronic course materials must be made accessible to students with disabilities in accordance with the World Wide Web Consortium Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. As more courses are being delivered fully online at many universities, there is a growing need to ensure that these courses are ADA accessible and inclusive. Accommodation in an online course is providing accurate closed captioning on lectures, which in turn supports students who may have impaired hearing or a learning disability. While we know that closed captioned lectures are a necessity for students with disabilities, the current literature also indicates that closed caption lectures benefit every student in the classroom. Research has shown that captions on lectures support language development for students who speak English as a second language. As early as 2006, Reba and McIver observed that ESL students responded positively to automated closed caption, even though the participants in the study recognized many of the errors and inaccuracies in the captions themselves. Since 2006, a decent amount of research has confirmed these findings. Gersbacher in 2015 doesn't leave any life stage out of potential beneficiaries. She mentions children, adolescents, college students, adult learners, L2 language learners, and many of us who watch online streaming platforms, TV series and movies and whatnot, can attest to the comfort of having these captions displayed at the bottom of the screen. A number of these studies demonstrate how captioning increases student engagement in lectures as well as the ability to retain and recall information. Building on these results, Kent and Ellis in 2017 have published guidelines that attempt to standardize the formatting and punctuation for closed captions in Australia. Dr. Miller and I have been taking this global issue and situating it into a local context, which is teaching linguistics at our university in Dallas. Dr. Miller has led student research on this topic last fall. Two of our students, Daisy Flores and Oscar Moreno Arias, measured the accuracy of automated closed captioning in Panopto and YouTube. Their data source were our own linguistics lectures. They took 10 recordings that we had created for our coursework. Some were over 30 minutes, while others were as short as 10 minutes. Added up, it was well over 245 minutes of closed captioning that they had to code and compare. All 245 minutes were run through the voice recognition software for Panopto and YouTube. They compared the two transcriptions side by side. As it turns out, Panopto was less accurate than YouTube, 64% compared to 88%. Yet an important question still remains. Is 88% good enough for students? Certainly not for deaf students, but what about the average viewer? And what about linguistics content? We argue that even 88% accuracy is still quite confusing for the average hearing student of our videos. For example, when we talk about language acquisition and the typical errors that a 7-year-old might make while learning the past tense forms of English, we discuss several examples of the regularization of irregular verbs. So we write on our PowerPoints and we say in our lectures, Carlos cutted the cake, to demonstrate this particular stage in L1 acquisition. The closed captioning system will transcribe it as Carlos cut it the cake. This is a very important point in our lecture, and if the captions are not accurate and correct, students become confused and they miss the main idea of the lesson. Other discussions about prefixes and suffixes are horribly butchered by the voice recognition technology systems, both in Panopto and in YouTube. We have developed a working style guide to help us accurately transcribe online materials for both hearing and hearing impaired students. For the most part, it is based on punctuation style guides for traditional print publishing. Notable added features are brackets to enclose text read from the screen. This helps viewers know when they should stop reading the closed captions and start focusing on the content shared on the screen, such as content on a PowerPoint or Prezi presentation. Borrowing from conversation analysis, we use the dash to indicate change in topic and or new abrupt sentence shifts. This happens quite frequently when instructors are explaining concepts and giving examples and illustrations of language and language errors. We all do this when we talk. They're kind of like speech errors. We stop and start sentences midway, and this is an indication to the viewer that something has changed in the sentence or the delivery. Commonplace in linguistics and phonology, we employ standard markings and diacritics for language as an object or the pronunciation of language. So we use forward slashes for phonemes and sound. So we implement this style guide in all of our online lectures. Now we're interested in knowing if students find this type of punctuation helpful. If any of the features in this guide can be improved, we'd like to know. And also, we are interested in our study to know the preferences among deaf and hearing impaired students versus hearing students.
This brings us to part 2 of our presentation, our proposed study, which is to develop a closed captioning style guide tailored to education, and more specifically, those teaching language and linguistics. So at this point, we know that we can't solely rely on automated captionings for our lectures. We also know that accurate closed captioning offers many benefits to our students, and that if we have a hearing impaired student, accurate closed captioning is vital for that student's success with the material. We need captions that accurately depict the oral material in a way that helps facilitate the learning process. The question then becomes, what makes for effective captioning in language teaching and linguistics? Is it merely enough to correct spelling and punctuation errors caused by automated captioning? So one thing we did discover is that there are existing closed captioning style guides that provide insights on making captioning effective. Here I've provided a list of dominant style guides available online, and some of these guides go pretty in depth. Each of these models has some easily applicable guidelines, and each of these models were developed by professionals. Upon our research, we also discovered that some universities even provide captioning style guides for their faculty. But university-devised style guides are few and far between. In fact, if your university or school has one, surprise us by letting us know in the comments. And these university style guides are often very brief and very generic, usually modeled directly from one of these larger style guides. Okay, so when we look at these style guides, we notice some challenges. The first being that none of these models are exactly the same. They have some similarities, but certainly differ in what they claim are the best practices for approaching captioning, especially punctuation. So if you're new to captioning, it can make it challenging to know which method is best when there are many different best methods. These style guides are also heavily tailored to videos that might be used for entertainment purposes, with suggestions on how to close caption sound effects, reactions like laughing or crying, music, and more things of that nature, which we don't typically use or portray in lectures, unless it's crying. Maybe some of you have cried making your 100th pre-recorded lecture during COVID. So the guides are pretty in-depth, but this means that you're also combing through some rather lengthy web pages looking for information that pertains to your needs in captioning your lectures. Finally, a majority of the best practices available are suggestions for things that are outside of an educator's control, like font size and placements of the captions. So this is whether you want the captions to be on the top of the screen or at the bottom of the screen, which just aren't things that you and I can control on platforms like YouTube and Panopto. So from here, we had two questions. If each style guide is going to offer different best practices, how do we know which best practices are actually best for our students? And secondly, what styles should we be using in place of best practices that we can't apply to our lectures? In other words, when these style guides suggest one approach, but we're not able to use that approach. Let me show you an example. So in writing, if we wanted to introduce a new term, so let's take the term phoneme as an example. And if I wanted to introduce this term to my class for the first time, I might highlight that word in bold or italics, or perhaps even underline the word. When we come across these font styles in writing, we understand that they're signifying important information. So it's not surprising that most closed captioning style guides suggest that for important words or things you want to emphasize, you should bold them or put them in italics. The problem becomes that most video sharing platforms that faculty have access to do not have this font style feature, especially YouTube and Panopto. So what should we be doing instead to capture the same emphasis? Another example, as language educators and linguists, we often draw from languages other than English, and not all models offer a styling solution that is fitting for education when it comes to how foreign words, or rather non-English words, should be handled in closed captioning. Most style guides agree that you should provide the foreign language text, but some of the style guides actually suggest using a description, such as speaking Spanish or foreign language, to substitute for the dialogue. And as you can imagine, a language description tag won't accomplish the appropriate task in a lecture. One last example, if you're like us, you're usually presenting your lectures alongside some visual information, such as a PowerPoint. Captioning models suggest that you shouldn't capture information that is already shown on the screen. So when we see a clip like this one I'm about to show you, you'll notice that the text on the notepad isn't provided in the captioning because it's assumed the viewer can read it on their own.
Dear Darla, I hate your stinking guts. You make me vomit. Your scum between my toes. Love, alfalfa.
So what often happens in lectures is a faculty member will present some information on the slide, and they may read from the slide or paraphrase the information on the slide. They may read each bullet point back to back, or perhaps even read one bullet point at a time. And in between each point, they may elaborate on related ideas and talk about information that is not available on the PowerPoint slide itself. So closed captioning models would say, don't caption information that is on the screen because your students can read it. Many of us, though, read our PowerPoints out loud, and if you're not, you should, because if you are working with visually impaired students, you need to orally explain the visual information. So on the one hand, style guides say you should absolutely close caption everything you say. But on the other hand, style guides suggest that if it's on the screen already, you shouldn't also caption it. So what should we do? Well, why don't we just ask our students? That's who we're captioning for, right? So we sought out to do just that. Our goal is to develop a closed captioning model for education, and one of those things that distinguishes this model from other style guides is the desire to assess user preference. So in this case, the user is the student. We want students to tell us which closed captioning styles best suit their needs. Existing captioning models are said to have been developed by teams of professionals, and even so, each style guide is different than the next. So in order to address the question of which styles are best for our students, we're asking students to identify the methods they prefer. The idea is to develop one working model that addresses the needs of those in education, especially those teaching language or linguistics, but the model at large is applicable across disciplines. We also want to uncover the best practices that are within the educator's control, so you can use these best practices no matter the technological limitations of Panopto or YouTube or another video sharing platform you might be using at your institution. To do this, we've devised 2 surveys which will be distributed to students, and our goal is to poll students that are hearing, hard of hearing, and students from the deaf community. The objective of the first survey, we'll call it Part A, is to narrow down the style choices that are going to be presented in the second survey. So in the first survey, there are 9 questions, and they are presented as text-only multiple choice questions, which I'll show you an example of one in a moment. The second survey, Part B, is also 9 multiple choice questions, but instead of generic text, students watch and select from closed captioned video clips. So let's look at an example of Part A. When we initially drafted an outline for this project, specifically Part B, which is what I'm going to show you next, it became clear that we needed to be concerned about participant fatigue. With the use of video clips in Part B, the amount of times participants would need to scroll and push play was very repetitive. So in order to eliminate the amount of clips we would need in the second survey, we devised Part A to be able to eliminate some of the closed caption style options. So here we have an example question from Part A that reads, "The following text introduces you to the suffix un, as in unthinkable. Which sentence style makes the suffix un more readable within the sentence?" Then you'll notice that we have 5 different options, some that use hyphens, brackets, and quotations. The style options were devised from the existing style guides we discussed earlier and our own practices. I want to point out that the bold, italic, and underline styles are not being presented as options because we want to work with styles that are available no matter the technological parameters of the video sharing platform an educator might be using. We also have an unstyled option, so an option without any punctuation around the suffix. So one of the things we're hoping to do with this first survey is identify which styles students prefer most, and in doing so, we can then go ahead and eliminate the options that students didn't prefer, which in turn makes the options more narrow for Part B. We're hoping from this first survey that we can at least eliminate all the non-stylized or non-punctuated options for each question, which in turn supports our theory that some punctuation is preferred over 0 punctuation or over no punctuation. So based on the results of this survey, we'll finalize the second survey. For the second survey, we're going to somewhat mirror the questions from the first survey. So here you can see that this question presents a similar topic as the last question we just looked at. When learning about suffixes, which sentence style makes the suffix ing more readable within the closed caption text? With this type of question, we're looking at the best way to present morphemes or parts of words to students in text. So the multiple choice options will actually be presented as video clips in the survey. So participants will read the prompt, when learning about suffixes, which sentence style makes the suffix ing more readable within the closed caption text? And then they'll watch each clip. I'm going to play a couple of these clips for you, but before you think something is wrong with the audio on your computer, I'll give you a heads up that the majority of the clips we're going to use in this survey will be intentionally muted, which will encourage participants to focus on the readability of the captions without having the assistance that audio offers. So here's what the clips for this particular question will look like. So for the second question, we're looking at spelling. So how should we stylize the letters of a word when we're spelling it out? So we ask, which sentence style best reflects the spelling out of the word color? And they'll select from different punctuated forms of British English speakers spell color as C-O-L-O-U-R with a U. Next, we're asking about styles for terms and definitions and key phrases, which after having to discard bolding, underlining, and italics, we're not left with many choices. But participants are asked which sentence style best signals that you are being introduced to a new term and definition, and they'll make their selection from there. We also want to use this time to question students on their preference for how words from other languages should be presented in captioning. So here we have an illustration of false cognates between Spanish and English, and so we want students to go ahead and identify that they'd prefer the words spelled out rather than a language description tag. I mean, I think they'll clearly rule out the descriptor, but we can go ahead and validate that theory by including it in this survey. For this next question, we're looking at something that's pretty common in everyone's lectures, regardless of what you teach. So here we're looking at stuttering. So if I say, today we are going to look at the speech act of complimenting. So in this example, I've obviously stuttered, and closed captioning style guides say that you should caption exactly what is said. So if I stutter or stammer in my oral presentation, then I need to capture exactly that. However, for the sake of an effective presentation, it would not seem logical to me to include the stuttered text in my captioning. And it certainly doesn't make the captioning editing process easier if I need to go in and write in the stuttering. So with this question, we're simply investigating our theory that students prefer if the stuttering was omitted from the caption text. We're also going to look at stops in speech, so things like false starts. But we're approaching this a little different than stuttering and stammering. We're not trying to omit it, but we're trying to identify the best way to punctuate and signify when the sentence or the thought has moved in a different direction. So what helps convey that the topic or the sentence changed course? And we have the example sentence, they always wanted, well, let me back up. It started in 1964. We're also looking to narrow down the ideal method for emphasized speech. So what punctuation method is preferred for stress? And here we have a few style variations for the sentence, you must turn in the assignment tomorrow. Finally, we circle back to visual aids and whether or not to caption text that is spoken, yet also already available on the screen. And I think the best way to illustrate the style varieties of this one and the issues with current styling guides is by showing you a few of the video clips. And I'll play them in this order. The first clip will be one example of captioning the PowerPoint text. So I'm reading the PowerPoint slide and I've captioned what I've read. In the second clip, I don't caption the text that is on the PowerPoint slide. I'll only provide captioning for what I'm saying that is not on the PowerPoint slide. And this is what some style guides suggest that you do. And for the third clip, I'll follow the advice of another style guide that suggests, again, to not caption text that is on the screen, but instead use a descriptor, so something to the effect of reading PowerPoint at times that I'm reading from the PowerPoint. All three of these clips are muted, which we think is important for illustrating how captions work as a visual aid for keeping up with and following along in a lecture. So from here, we're aiming to create a style guide that works for those in education. And while we're namely focused on the best ways to present linguistics and languages in closed caption text, the developed styles are applicable to many other disciplines. We also know it will be beneficial to develop a style guide that has best practices within the educator's control, no matter the limitations of the video sharing platform they're using. Of course, the real benefit of a summative style guide is the impact it will have on our students. We're hoping to gain an understanding of which closed captioning practices best serve the collective student body. Best practices that hopefully help our students learn and retain information in an online environment. We know that the more accurate the captioning, the more the students can benefit from it. We also know that the right styles will do a better job at transmitting the oral speech into writing, and that the right styles will do a better job at conveying structure in writing. So we're curious which styles the students will claim help them to scan and process the written captions. This can ultimately lead to further studies on reading and punctuation and studies on retention of information. So if students prefer specific punctuation styles, can we assess that those styles or absence of those styles impacts their retention of material? Thank you so much for your time today. We're interested in hearing from you, so please let us know if you have any questions or comments.